For the past about, I don't know, 12 to 18 months, I've been coming on the floor of the House and talking about various aspects of the rule of law. The rule of law is the underpinning upon which our society is built. And we've talked about this over and over. We've talked about it in terms of ethical issues that pertain to people in this House. And we talk about it in terms of criminal actions. We've talked about it in terms of what's going on with our military. You've heard some speakers here tonight raise some issues concerning how we fight wars, rules of engagement. All of these are rules we set for ourselves in some form or fashion. Well, I've also been on this floor talking about the fact that political correctness, in my humble opinion, is becoming so rampant in our society that we forget the why of what we're doing because we're so afraid of offending someone. I am from Central Texas. My district includes the largest military facility as far as soldiers are concerned on the face of the globe, Fort Hood, Texas. I think everybody will always, those of us in Central Texas, we know Fort Hood, and when we hear Fort Hood, we have a lot of great thoughts about the great soldiers out there. We have great thoughts about the great commanders that serve at Fort Hood, about the awesome accomplishments of the soldiers that have passed through Fort Hood for generations, fighting our nation's battles on every shore you can imagine, and all over this country, dating back to the Civil War. Or the Fort Hood doesn't date back to the Civil War, but Fort Hood is named after a Civil War soldier. We are proud of Fort Hood, but unfortunately, because of something that happened this year, Fort Hood will also be identified always in the minds of American citizens as a place where a terrorist stabbed people in the back by walking down the line of soldiers and shooting soldiers just standing in line, either checking in from going to war or checking out, getting ready to go to war. They were not armed. They were not doing anything more than what's required of them by the Army to process into or out of a facility. And yet, a man who's now, we call him the accused, but over 200 people witnessed Mr. Hassan go on a shooting rampage, killing soldiers who were doing nothing more than standing in line or processing another soldier. These were not people that were at war or were armed to defend themselves. Had they been armed to defend themselves, Mr. Hassan wouldn't have gotten over more than maybe one shot before he would have died, because these were professional soldiers who knew exactly how to take care of business. But they were not armed. And in fact, they were in a safe place. That's the sad thing. They were in a safe place, a place where they should have been safe, or where they thought they were safe, and where maybe never again they will think that they are safe because of what happened that day. Now, this was not some terrorist that sneaked into our country. This was a man that had joined the United States Army, and through the goodness of the American citizen and the American taxpayer, received a medical degree with a psychiatric specialty, and all of this was paid for by the United States Army. He did his medical school, his residency, his post-residency training, and his residency for psychiatry, all while working for the United States Army, and all paid for by the United States government. He was an American citizen. And yet, homemade jihadism, we're now calling it, and some of that's been in the news this week, caused this man to go out and murder 13 people and one unborn child, and wound or injure 43 additional people. There's one soldier right now, I won't mention his name, but if he's watching, he'll know who I'm talking about. He's sitting in a hospital in South Austin, He was shot multiple times. He's had a plate put in his head, and it was rejected, and he's going to have another plate put in his head. When I talked to his father said, you know, 2 deployments. We prayed and worried our son all the way through 2 deployments. He came out with not a scratch. He's at home where he should be safe, and this animal killed him, almost killed him. And he's surviving through his heart being big and being tough and having a family and an army that supports him. But this young man had been so successful in his last deployment that they were sending him to officers candidate school. But so he was not even stationed at Fort Hood. He was just transitioning through there to officers candidate school when he was shot. He still hopes to be an officer in the United States Army, and we are very hopeful that he will be, but he's a seriously wounded soldier. But he's going to make it, and hopefully he'll get back in the Army that he loves. And this is this domestic terrorist that decided he would take it upon himself to start a fight right there at Fort Hood. Not a real fight, a one-sided fight where he was the only guy with a gun. He had 2 of them. And he got to selectively shoot who he wanted to shoot. And he shot men and women in uniform. I don't know about you, but I think this was just another theater of war. A war that we've been fighting in Iraq, and a war that we've been fighting in Afghanistan against these terrorists who indiscriminately think that they have the right to kill in the name of whatever cause they call it. Some would say they are religious fanatics. Others would say they are jihadists and have some kind of fanatical following, whatever it may be. This is who we've been at war with now for 10 or 12 years. And as we were told when it all started, it's going to be a long fight, maybe the longest in the history of the Republic. And it's approaching that now. So I think these young men and women were killed on the battlefield of Fort Hood. And that's why I've introduced a piece of legislation to have them get the kind of benefits that people who get killed in combat or wounded in combat get. And that is that if there are medals to be awarded, they should get a medal. If they're wounded, they should get a Purple Heart. I've already heard a story of a sergeant who was there with several of his troops. The sergeant was shot 4 times, and as the man lowered the pistol to fire the 5th time, one of his enlisted men, thinking he couldn't take anymore, jumped in between the shooter and the sergeant to protect his sergeant and took the 3 other rounds that were fired. Now, had that taken place on the battlefield, I'm sure that would be something that would be heroism in the line of fire. And I think that young man should be awarded something like Bronze Star, Silver Star, something like that. I don't know. I'm not saying what medal, but he ought to get a medal for it. And they ought to get, if there are families that were from this combat experience, either lost a loved one or were injured from this battle at Fort Hood, I think they ought to get the extended combat benefits that we give to our soldiers when we send them into harm's way on a battlefield. And I think the American people, if they heard about that, would think, sure, they ought to get that. This was just another battle. Because remember, the testimony will be when this trial comes out, because I've talked to a lot of these soldiers that were there, that he was shooting soldiers. If he hit any civilians, it's just because he missed. But he was walking down the line shooting soldiers. He was declaring war on the American soldier. I wanted to talk tonight about Fort Hood and what's going on there. That the fact that we've got a report out that doesn't even mention radical jihadists or mention even the name of the shooter. And I'm afraid it was done because somebody was afraid they were going to step on somebody's toes. I've had some tell me they did it because they wanted to protect the prosecution of this man, and being a judge who tried cases in his courtroom for 20 years, including, I believe, 5 or 6 capital murder cases, I can assure you that if you can't prove a case with 200 eyewitnesses, you got a serious problem with your lawyers. So I don't hesitate to say what I think about this thing, because I think it was wrong for them not to report accurately who the person was and what he did. I'm joined by a good friend of mine who is a former federal prosecutor, Mike McCaul. He's my friend, my colleague from Texas, my neighbor right down the road. And I'm glad he's come to join us, and I'll yield to my friend, Mr. McCaul, whatever time he wishes to consume.
I thank the gentleman from Texas in your hosting this leadership hour and your great leadership on this issue. You and I see this the same way. And you were a judge, I was a federal prosecutor. We respect the rule of law, but we respect the truth. And we call it like it is. We call it like we see it. That's what Texans do. And the way I see it is this matter has been swept under the rug. We're not calling it what it is. You and I think we're some of the first 2 members of Congress to stand up and say, you know what? That was an act of terrorism that occurred the other day at Fort Hood. That was an act of a terrorist, not some, criminal defendant. This was an act of terrorism. You stood up representing Fort Hood in your usual way and said that's what it was, and I stood up and said the same, and it took months before the Secretary of Homeland Security came before our committee and finally acknowledged what we had said all along, and that this was truly an act of terrorism. And I want to congratulate you for your bill, which essentially acknowledges it for what it was, and that was an act of war on U.S. soil. Combat. Recognizing the victims and their families, giving them the combat pay that they deserve. You and I were at the ceremony, the memorial service, one of the most dramatic memorial services I think I've ever attended. I know the gentleman feels the same way. And I just wanted to hold up a picture of that tragic day where we had 13 pairs of combat boots, 13 rifles with 13 helmets, honoring the dead, and of course 1 unborn child, 43 injured, 2 of those injured standing next to me in this photograph. And I asked them the question because they're the best evidence. They are the best evidence. What happened that day? They were shot by him. What did he say to you? And these 2 said, Congressman, he said, Allahu Akbar. He screamed, Allahu Akbar, as he gunned down my colleagues in cold blood, as he wounded 43 soldiers on the base, the largest military installation in the country. And who is this man? I met with General Cohen at the ceremony, and I said, would you like to have known that a major on your base was making communications with the top al-Qaeda operative? Sure, I would have. What happened that day? The Joint Terrorism Task Force, who I used to work with when I was a prosecutor, had that evidence. A Department of Defense representative on the JTTF had that evidence. But for a variety of reasons, and I've questioned witnesses on this, did not want to share that with the commander of Fort Hood for a variety of reasons. But for God's sakes, at least let the commanding officer know that he's got a major. This is not some ordinary event. A major on his base talking to an al-Qaeda operative in Yemen, a man who has come to our attention in a big way recently with the Christmas bomber, the same radical cleric who talked to the Christmas bomber. But who is Mr. Hassan? And thank God he's a terrorist that is going to face a military tribunal. Well, he was born from Jordanian immigrants. And you know, each of these, as the case unfolded, if you will, raised a flag as to who is this man. And we talk a lot about connecting the dots, but these were dots that popped up that failed to be acted upon. Why weren't these dots acted upon? A man who said his allegiance was to the Quran, not the Constitution. A man who described the war on terrorism as a war against Islam, according to a doctor who was in a graduate program with him. A man who argued that Muslims were being targeted by U.S. anti-terror campaigns. A former classmate said of Mr. Hassan, he was very vocal about the war, very upfront about being a Muslim first and an American second. And if that's politically incorrect for me to say that, all I'm saying here in this chamber is the truth. You take it for what it is. He was also concerned that Muslims in the military were being persecuted. On his business cards, this is all the evidence of this man. Business card said, "Soldier of Allah." We know that the morning of the shooting, he wore traditional Pakistani garb. At the 7-Eleven that morning, he was known to wear that off-duty. Certainly, there are religious protections in this country for that. But all these flags put together shows us an individual who is presenting a threat to the soldiers. We know Al-Qaeda has targeted military installations. We know they targeted Fort Dix. The question that General Cohn asked me was, we just don't know how many more Hassans are out there. How many more Hassans are out there who are a direct threat to our military installations? The cleric in Yemen basically said that Hassan trusted him and praised him as a hero after the shooting. You know, God is great. That's what he screamed when he shot those men in cold blood. I can't think of anything more sickening to my heart as a God-fearing man, a Christian, or anybody who believes in God, to believe in a God where you could say God is great as you're killing somebody. That's a perverted, twisted religion. That is what we are dealing with. I have asked the Homeland Security Committee through letters, I'm ranking on the Homeland Security Intelligence Subcommittee. I asked my chairwoman, Jane Harmon, to hold hearings on this. We asked Benny Thompson, the majority chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, to hold hearings on this matter, because the American people are entitled to know what happened that day. And yet we got a report that really didn't say a whole lot, a report that was so politically correct it didn't even mention radical Islam. Well, in my view, that's what this war is all about that we're in right now, is a war against the extremists, against a radical, perverted teaching of Islam that says it's okay to kill in the name of Allah. And the day we recognize that in this country, I think is the day we're going to be a lot safer. I have a lot more to say, but I know the gentleman has probably some comments. But I do want to thank you for being one of the first ones to step out of the box to say this was an act of terrorism. I'm glad that Napolitano's come around to that same conclusion. And I want to thank you also for your steadfast support for our troops. You represent a base that has more soldiers than any in the world. And I know how proud you are of them and how well you represent them, and I want to personally thank you for that.
Well, I thank my friend Mr. McCaul for those kind words. And let's look at this exhibit we've got here, because this Congressman McCaul, you've touched on a lot of these things, but you know it was said by Mr. Nadal Hassan that he felt like he was being persecuted by people. And I had an old Gulf War colonel who said, the Army must have changed a whole lot since I left the Army, because I never did know any enlisted men that would persecute a major in the United States Army. And, that makes no sense what he says, that enlisted men were persecuting a major. It makes no sense. But the first question you need to ask yourself is, how does a man who's shown the signs of radical Islamic behavior on multiple occasions, who's acted erratically for months before the attack, and I would argue, and the evidence will show, actually for years before the attack. In fact, one of our members of this House has talked to a doctor who went through medical school with him and said he was doing this in medical school, which is long before this period of time. How did he, and he promoted radical Islamic views at Walter Reed Hospital. He exchanged emails with this Awalaki character, this radical Iman character. How does a guy do those things and get promoted to major? He didn't start out in the Army as a major. He got promoted to major. He got moved down the line. Well, I'm going to tell you, and this is only my opinion, but it's based on some experience I've had in my life. I tried a case one time back in the 80s that involved a nurse. And in our case, she was accused of killing a baby while giving it its injections for typhoid tetanus at a doctor's office, and intentionally killing that baby. And there was an awful lot of evidence that while working in a intensive care neonatal unit in San Antonio, a lot of other babies died very mysteriously on her watch. And unless I'm mistaken, she got life imprisonment, and she's still there. But what's interesting is the system she was working in, when they started seeing unusual behavior, rather than doing something about it for a fear of offending someone, they just recommended her for another job. And this pediatrician that was operating in Kerrville had asked whether this nurse would be a good nurse to go to work for them, and she got glowing reports from people who were looking at records and saying something's wrong when this lady's on duty. And you ask, why would people do that? Well, because people have gotten to where we're so afraid of stepping on somebody's toes or offending someone because of their class, sexual classification, whatever it may be, that we don't just speak the truth. Something smells here. Something's bad. This doesn't make sense. We need to ask questions about this. We can't have a society like this. We have to be able, when we see something that looks wrong, to say that's wrong. That's why I've got a bill that I introduced, and we'll be working on it even further, the Military Whistleblower Protection Act. We have whistleblower protection, which is very effective in the United States in many categories. And one of the things that happens in the military is your progress report, how you're doing in your job in the military, is very important to whether you're going to be promoted to the next rank. And if you don't get promoted in the military, your days in the military are numbered. So you need to be promoted. And many people fear to speak out on something like this for fear that someone might think they are exhibiting some sort of prejudice or prejudicial behavior, which would go on their record and maybe prevent them from being advanced in the military, even though everything else they should be advanced. So they fear speaking out for fear of retribution. Well, in turn, they've made movies about whistleblowers. People know that in our society today, the guy that steps up and says something and gets fired because he said it has a protection under the law called Whistleblower Act. So I've asked us to look at granting to the members of Congress the right to create a Whistleblower Act and doing it to protect our soldiers. I think we need to be interrupted just a moment.
The chair will receive a message.
Madam Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Madam Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate shall convene as a court of impeachment at 2 p.m. March 17, 2010, for the purpose of receiving the managers on the part of the House in the matter of the impeachment proceedings against G. Thomas Porteus Jr., Judge of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Louisiana.
Gentleman from Texas may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So we've got a Whistleblower Act that basically says that service members can report unusual or bizarre behavior by other members, whether they be equal rank or other rank, without fear of retribution, and especially as it relates to radical Islamic threats, as we saw in this case. And, you know, Mr. McCaul mentioned one of the things that we need somebody in the Department of Defense to say is that this involved a radical Islamic terrorist event. And I've had my differences with Ms. Napolitano, but I will give her credit. When she was asked, both in Mr. McCaul's committee and in the Appropriations Subcommittee of Homeland Security, she made the statement that this was a violent Islamic terrorist act that took place at Fort Hood. She had the courage to call it what it is. It's time for the Defense Department to call it what it is, to recognize these were men and women put in harm's way because they were serving in the United States Army in the presence of an enemy combatant with a gun, and that's why they should get the kind of benefits, including medals, that should be awarded for heroism if they deserved them and they earned them. So I commend Secretary Napolitano for being a person who speaks the truth.
The gentleman will yield, and
yes, I'll yield.
It was refreshing to see that, and I agree. I don't always agree with her either, but she had the courage to call it like it is, like you and I called it for quite some time. And the sad thing is, there are 13 dead, 1 unborn, and 43 wounded, because people didn't have the guts to stand up and call it what it was. You know, the day that happened, it seemed to me a systematic process of trying to, and you know, like you said, I was a prosecutor too. If you can't win this case, you know, you need to get out of the business. The sweeping under the rug and not wanting to hold hearings on this issue and not willing to brief us. We finally got a briefing on this just a couple weeks ago for the first time. And you saw the impact this administration was trying to have on this whole thing, that no, this wasn't, you know, we can't really call it what it is because we don't want to offend anybody. Well, that's the same type of attitude that led to this monster killing 13 people to begin with. Was it when all these red flags popped up, and these dots, if you will, when they popped up, no one had the guts to act on it. And they wanted to sweep it under the rug. And they swept his promotion. You know, they promoted him even though all this was out there, swept it under the rug, and now even after the tragic events that happened that day, there is an attempt, in my view, to try to sweep all this under the rug and trying to move forward. And, you know, this is one example of many things that have happened this past year. I always said that, you know, they like to attack a president in the first year of office, Al-Qaeda. They did it with Bill Clinton, 93 World Trade Center. They did it with George W. Bush with 9/11, and I predicted that this was going to happen under this president's watch this year. And not only did this happen, but we had the same radical cleric tied to the Christmas bomber. Fortunately, Mr. Hassan will face a military tribunal. The Christmas bomber, on the other hand, will not. You know, we had several events over the last year of threats to the United States and multiple attempted terrorist attacks on the United States of America. And I think it's high time we recognize it and see it for what it is, to better protect the American people and our military bases that we know are being targeted right now. The idea that the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and again, these are friends of mine, but they had this information and they didn't. I understand compromising investigations, but you could at least let the general of the base know that he has an individual, a major, in his outfit talking to a top Al-Qaeda recruiter, and you may just want to put him under observation. You don't have to question him. You don't have to dig into his files. You don't have to put him on alert that we're looking at him, but you may just want to kind of monitor his actions, because There's some radical stuff going on, and potentially he could be a threat. This man did not believe in the mission. The irony of Mr. Hassan is he was the man trained and paid for by the taxpayer, the United States Army, to counsel people coming back from the theater of war, and he didn't believe in the mission. I can only imagine what kind of counseling he was giving to these troops coming back from the war theaters that you and I have been to in Iraq and Afghanistan, and what he was telling them when he himself didn't believe in the mission they were sent to do. That is the absurd irony of Mr. Hassan. And again, as General Cohn asked, how many more Mr. Hassans are out there? I think we have a duty in the Congress. I think the Department of Defense has a duty. I hope the Webster report will uncover more of this, but we have a duty to better protect our soldiers, not only abroad, but right here in the United States. And that is the great, awful, tragic event of what happened, was that it happened on American soil, and it happened in their home. And that's just not supposed to, that is not supposed to occur in this country. It needs to be taken seriously. It shouldn't be swept under the rug. And I think we should continue to do this and continue to ask the majority to hold hearings on this. And, you know, as Secretary Napolitano admitted, it was a violent Islamic terrorist attack. I think the Department of Defense needs to come forward with that as well. And I think we have an obligation to the American people not to sweep this under the rug, to prevent future actions from occurring. Our oversight responsibilities under the Constitution I take very seriously. And we have a duty here in the Congress to hold those hearings and get to the bottom of this case so we can stop it in the future. You know, I went down to Guantanamo after the president decided to close it down. And I saw Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And it was during prayer hour, and he was laying on his rug, bowing to Mecca. And it was one of the most chilling things I've ever seen in my life. A man responsible for killing 3,000 people, 3,000 Americans. And the idea that we're going to bring him into the United States. And look, I'm a federal prosecutor. The Southern District of New York, one of the best U.S. attorney's offices in the country. But are we going to treat these people as criminal defendants or enemy combatants? Are we going to say that this is a war or a criminal prosecution? It seems to me that we're slipping back into the Clinton years, where we really looked at these as really just illegal criminal prosecution, not an act of warfare perpetrated against the United States of America. And it seems to me, particularly with the top 16 al-Qaeda operatives, who many of whom were responsible for 9/11, that was an act of warfare, and it should be treated as such. And with that, I yield back.
This exhibit right here has a picture, actually, of the Pentagon right after it was hit. We have this displayed here because in talking about the receiving of medals by our soldiers at Fort Hood and getting the kind of benefits that you get for being in combat, we awarded the people killed and injured with that the plane flew into the Pentagon with exactly those benefits. And I am told by members of the Armed Services Committee that it was done without an act of Congress. Although I've asked for this Congress to act, I've also written a letter to Secretary Gates asking him for the same administrative remedy for these casualties of the war on terror on American soil. We gave it to them, a horrendous act. That picture and other pictures from that time should be cemented in our memory forever. But whether you kill 3,000 or whether you kill 14 and injure 43, these are still American people who lost their lives at the hands of terrorists in the middle of the war on terror, the war on radical Islamic jihadism. It's time for us to step up to the plate for these people and do this for them.
If the gentleman will yield, I was proud to be a co-sponsor of your bill, and I hope we see it pass in short order. And I agree with you. That was an attack on American soil by the terrorists, and according to the Secretary of Homeland Security, so was Fort Hood. And American soldiers were killed. So how can we differentiate between the Pentagon and Fort Hood? Both symbols of military might and power in the United States. And I think it is fitting to the families. I would hope the majority would see it the same way, that this was an act of terror perpetrated on American soldiers, and military might and power, a symbol of that, and give them the just compensation that they gave the same victims of 9/11 out of the Pentagon. I can think of no reason why that legislation should be blocked by the majority.
And reclaiming my time, let me state that I have many members of both sides of the aisle that have joined in co-sponsoring this bill. I think when we get through some of this other business that are taking forever around here, we might get down to something like this. I agree with you. It is, this was supposed to be an oversight Congress. I think in many ways there's a valid attempt to try to be an oversight Congress, and nothing is more important for oversight than an issue like this. And that is just what happened and how did it happen. And you say, well, why? Okay, people were killed. It's got bigger ramifications than that. That's what's so hard to understand. This was a man wearing the same uniform of the people he shot. And I want to share a story, and I've shared it before on the floor of the House. The day after all this took place, I was at Fort Hood. I was out at Darnall Hospital, where there were wounded out there who had been transported both there and all over our district, where, yeah. I mean, our community from all the way down into Williamson County, from Bell County, Coryell County, the whole surrounding area just united behind the medical community, behind this terrible act, and gave the very best medical care available anywhere for these people. But I was talking to a nurse, and she said when she was deployed to Afghanistan, she worked in a hospital with Australians. And she got an email from an Australian nurse the morning I visited Fort Hood, which was the day after the shooting. And in that email, the lady said, you know, soldiers in the Australian Army are starting to question and asking this question of mental health professionals in our Army already today. If the Americans can't trust the people in their uniform, can we trust the people in our uniform? Now remember, if you're in the military and you're a soldier, we like to say we depend on each other in this place. But when they say they depend on each other, they mean they put their life in the hands of the man behind them, the man on either side of them, and the man in front of them, and they in turn have those people's lives in their hands. The military functions by knowing that each can do their job and trusting their other one to do it. And so there's something that strikes into the psyche of a soldier. When a fellow soldier publicly executes 13 people and ultimately resulting in the death of an unborn child, 14 deaths, wearing the same uniform as the people who were shot. And so it strikes to the soul of a soldier. We are doing our very best, and I would say doing a good job of overcoming that. These are awfully, awfully talented young men and women in the Army. But it's still there. It's still creating distrust, driving a wedge in our military. And arguably, it's as effective a strike as you can have if you cause folks to distrust. So this has big scope. And in truth of fact, what would we think if somebody we trusted to have our backs started shooting people in this place? We'd wonder who we could trust.
The gentleman will yield on that.
Yield back.
I couldn't agree. I think this was in some ways worse than 9/11, because there, the enemy was a foreign radical Islamic terrorist. In this case, these soldiers are saluting their colleagues who lost their life, who were killed by a major in the U.S. Army who was wearing the very same military uniform that they are. And the idea that he could betray his soldiers like this, and not only betray but kill them, that's what I think makes this so so very, very hard to accept. And, you know, Alaki, the Yemeni cleric, said that Hassan trusted him. The radical cleric said that Hassan trusted him. Unfortunately, the army trusted Mr. Hassan and promoted him through the ranks. Because of political correctness, he was never called out for his behavior, which we know was a problem. We know the flags were raised. I mean, I'm not making this stuff up. I mean, business cards that say "Soldier of Allah." The jihadist line he used when he killed them in cold blood. You know, talking about that the war on terrorism is a war against Islam. And it just makes you wonder, how could we have promoted someone in the United States Army and the United States military when these types of flags are going up? Who said his allegiance was to the Quran, not the Constitution? And you know what, Judge, you're absolutely right. The morale, which is so important in a time of war that we are in, is critical here. And if we can't act upon cases like this in the United States Army, in the United States, because out of fear that we won't be politically correct, we may hurt someone's feelings. Where have we gone in this country? We can't call it out like it is and say it for what it is. And that this man did not love his country, that he had more loyalty to radical Islam, and that's precisely why he killed those 13 soldiers that day. With that, I yield back.
I'll make another argument besides that, and then I'm going to let my good friend Mr. King from Iowa talk a little bit. I would also argue that the way this thing has been treated, I would say with kid gloves, makes the next homegrown terrorist, of which we've seen, what, 2 or 3 in the last 2 weeks appear, Jihad Jane, and I think there's another one now, Jihad Jenny or somebody. These women who are American citizens who are now promoting jihadist terrorism, and the underwear bomber on Christmas Day, Christmas Day. So these people, I think, by looking the soft kid glove activity of a murderer on a military base, I think it encourages them to get involved in this stuff. If they got a screw loose, which most of these people do, I think it just encourages them.
And if the gentleman yield on that point, the same radical cleric who praised Mr. Hassan's actions and called him a hero is the same radical cleric who was behind the Christmas bomber.
Yeah.
Tied to this, you know, this is no coincidence here. It's connecting back to a radical Al-Qaeda operative out of Yemen. Why in the world the General Cohen didn't know about this, a major on his base, is really beyond me. And that's what we got to fix looking forward with the JTTFs and with the Department of Defense. We've talked to them about that. The Christmas bomber, a whole nother, but how many more Christmas bombers are out there too? How many more people are Alaki influencing, the radical cleric? You know, Jihad Jane, I mean, they all go to these websites. And not only do we have to deal with the Al-Qaeda operatives overseas, but this kind of act inspires them. And the fact that we could have let this happen inspires them. And then how many more radical homegrown terrorists are potentially out there in the United States? We know that the radical cleric has now said every man, just one man, one incident. They're decentralizing. They're saying one man can carry out, take a gun, take an explosive device. That's in a very radical departure from how Al-Qaeda had worked in the past. And it's coming from the same individual that was tied to Mr. Hassan and to the Christmas bomber, and we better wake up to that. I yield back.
Let me say as a comment that I have a huge respect for General Cohen and the outstanding job he did with the situation that happened at Fort Hood. And this is the same man who was preparing to deploy 3 Corps to Afghanistan to start the very serious business of pulling American soldiers out of that combat zone. With that on his plate, this fell in his lap. I think he did an outstanding job of handling it. And by the way, he still on time deployed the 3rd Corps to Afghanistan, to Iraq, and he is right now today over there doing our bidding and our job of pulling down, making elections work, and pulling down the forces for the taking out of 50,000 plus soldiers in August. He's a great American and an outstanding soldier.
If I could echo
I want to
those
yield to
sentiments.
Mr. King from Iowa, however, what time he wants to take to talk about these issues of radical Islamic jihadism and not letting political correctness silence our mouths.
I thank the judge from Texas for yielding and my friends from Texas for being here to lead on this special order tonight. And you've especially felt it more than anyone else outside of Texas, the pain of the 14 that were murdered by Major Hassan. And the question arises that we need to face, and it's something that we've talked around a little bit here, and I don't know that we've talked to it directly, and that is the issue of profiling. What is it about people that make us think that we should be a little more suspicious of them than somebody else? And I grew up in a law enforcement family, and a couple of things never occurred to the law enforcement extended family that I grew up in, and one of them was to ignore the law or the rule of law, and another one would be to ignore the very evidence in front of your eyes. A good thing about police work and investigation is you see things that are out of order, you notice those, turn your focus on that, wonder why it's out of order, and the instincts and the training, which is profiling to one fashion or another, causes those law enforcement resources to be used in a far more effective fashion, and time after time, crimes are solved because there have been police officers that understood the anomalies in the people. Now, it doesn't mean that we use, and I'm opposed to using law enforcement to go out and target people because of race, religion, or ethnicity. But when it's before your very eyes, and when you see people going in and out of the airports, and who has been blowing up our planes and who has been hijacking us, it's young Muslim men. And so I would suggest that instead of spread eagle searching the 80-year-old Norwegian grandmother with blue eyes and white hair, we ought to turn our focus in a higher percentage on the people that fit the profile of the kind that are likely to bomb us. Now, it's unfortunate that there are a lot of innocent people that would fit that profile, but it's far more unfortunate if we waste our resources searching people that have no history and in their profile doesn't fit anybody that would be bombing an airline. And that's just simple common sense, and it's good police work. But we are so politically correct in this country, we wallow in self-guilt in America. We go back and look at ourselves and figure out, somebody once pointed the finger and said, well, you're bigoted, you're racist, and so therefore we have to bend over backwards to demonstrate we'll do all kinds of foolish expenditures of our taxpayers' dollars to avoid anybody being able to point statistically to the focus of resources where the resources should be focused. And I don't suggest, Madam Speaker, that we ought to simply profile and put all of our efforts into one particular profile. I just suggest that we score them according to a weight system and turn our focus on those in proportion to the degree of the score. That makes sense. And I would assume that that would have been the thing we would have done after September 11th, but in reality, no, we're a nation with self-guilt. Another component of this would be Major Hassan. The question that came out was, whatever happened that he got radicalized? We use the term got radicalized as if somehow it's not their fault. We allowed an environment or nurtured an environment. Every individual that attacks people and kills them is responsible for their own actions. And the radicalization does take place. It's by their will and by the will of people like Alaki. And so we are also so politically correct that we won't go in and listen to the radicalization taking place. We won't tape the sermons in the mosques. We simply wait for something bad to happen. Therefore, nobody can point their finger at us and accuse us of being politically incorrect. Of course, they point their finger at me every day as politically incorrect, Madam Speaker. So I think that this nation needs to utilize our resources, utilize them wisely, do so in a fashion that is clearly for the purposes of enforcing the law and protecting the safety of the American people. And when we look into the psychology of the Army, and I have an Army tie on today, you might notice, that they need to also understand that they have the ability to speak up and keep an eye out for the kind of people that would come and kill us. The people that believe their path to salvation is in killing Jews, Christians, and capitalists in that order. If they can get a twofer, they're happy, and they believe that that's the eternal bliss for them if they can get that done. And I say there's a place for them in the next life, and it's not where they think. And I yield back to the judge from Texas and thank him for indulging me.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his comments. I think the most important thing we ought to do as Americans is be willing to stand up for what's right. And if it means that someone might get their feelings hurt, I don't have a problem with that. I am not for dragnets. I'm not for going out and shaking up communities like used to happen in the olden days, older than me anyway. In fact, there used to be a television show called Dragnet and a radio show called Dragnet. Those are wrong, and we're not talking about that. But we are talking about using good intelligence. And if we're going to kill our intelligence and not look at things because we're afraid we're going to hurt somebody's feelings, then we're going to get hit again. And if we get hit again, we're going to be standing around still asking the same questions we're asking here tonight. Why? What happened? Why did this happen? Why didn't we know? As my friend Mr. McCaul has been saying, we had the information to ask the question. Somebody should have asked it. That's the key.
Jim will yield on that
yes,
point.
I yield.
We had the information in both the Hassan case and the Christmas bomber. I made all the points about the Hassan case, all the flags that popped up, a failure to act upon those red flags. But, you know, indeed, in the Christmas bomber case, you had a State Department cable coming out that warned, the father had come in warning that his son was in touch with Islamic extremists in Yemen. And yet when I asked the Undersecretary of the State Department, Mr. Kennedy, why, in God's name, when you found that out, why didn't you revoke his visa? His response was, well, you know, a lot of people come into embassies and a lot of people give us tips, and I wouldn't necessarily, they're not all credible. And I said, well, this was not some anonymous source coming in. It was his father. Meanwhile, in the intelligence community, there's specific threat information coming in about this individual. State Department's got the cable. The intelligence community's got the threat information. It's not put together. Both sides could have acted on it. The intelligence community could have asked the State Department, does this guy have a passport? Does he have a visa? Can we revoke that? And the same with the State Department, and yet that didn't happen. We need to move forward to make sure a Christmas bomber never happens again, and to make sure with all the evidence coming in on Mr. Hassan, to make sure that individuals like this, the evidence isn't swept under the rug out of political correctness.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. King made the comment about crazy conservatives. So let's look at some crazy conservatives that made the same statements we're asking. I wouldn't classify Time magazine as one of the great conservative magazines of the 21st century. But here's an article from Time magazine asking the same question. The Fort Hood Report, why no mention of Islam? Here's another, I would say, not very conservative organization, the San Francisco Chronicle, asking the same question. Political correctness on Fort Hood at Pentagon. I think that it doesn't, you cross all boundaries here when you start getting down to the logical things we ought to be doing to fight people that are trying to kill us. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to say, Daddy says he's crazy and he may do something crazy, and you're getting reports that this guy's out there talking to this guy over in Yemen. These things start to fit together. Maybe you ought to check him when he hits the airport or before he takes off from, what was it, Brussels or Amsterdam. Fortunately, he had a misfire, and it didn't work. But he could have killed not only all the people in that airplane, but a whole lot of people on the ground in Detroit. And Detroit Mission's got enough problems right now without having somebody blowing up an airplane over their city. And God bless them.
If the gentleman yielded, it was preventable. I mean, you know, there's a lot of information coming in, and we have a lot of good men and women working counterterrorism. They got a tough job. A lot of information coming in, but we have these two major focal points that just were never acted upon and never put together in the Christmas bomber case. And Mr. Hassan, my God, how many points of error are popping up on him? how many red flags are popping up. And why weren't they acted upon? I think it goes back to your original point. We didn't want to hurt someone's feelings. And you know what? We see this in the federal government. They'd rather just kind of promote and move on somebody rather than have to deal with the problem. Gee, we have someone who's making these radical statements, but I'd rather not deal with the problem. Let's just push him along in the system. Let's transfer him from Walter Reed, where he was a major problem, we know that, poor performance evaluations, to one of the largest military installations in the country. And let's promote him to major in spite of the fact all these points of evidence were out on him. And I think that is the real tragedy. I know that my good friend from Texas has probably one of the most difficult jobs out of any member in this body. And that is because you have more soldiers in your district than any other. And you're the one who has to comfort them, as we all do. But you, many more times than any other member, have to comfort the loved ones whose son or daughter has been killed in a time of war. And I know you personally have comforted the families of the victims here in Fort Hood. And the biggest tragedy is that it could have been prevented. With that, I yield back.
Well, we're about to run out of time for this evening. Once again, we're talking about the rules we make for ourselves and how we should apply them. And I think it's honestly said here that let's don't be so politically correct that we oversee ills that may fall upon our society. That's why we make rules. That's why we have laws and order in our society, is so that we can protect our citizens, whether they be civilians or in the military. It's been a great evening, and I thank my friends, Mr. McCaul and Mr. King, for being here to join me in this conversation. I'm going to thank this House for allowing me to continue to talk about issues that relate to rules or to the law. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlemen,